Thank you so much. It is a great pleasure to be here. I learned a lot from hearing Tim, because I wasn't sure quite what the link between what I do and religious freedom is, and I agree with you. I think there are some important things to explore there. Let me start by, I don't know, do people who study politics feel like they have to say I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat? I don't know, but it has become clear to me as I've kind of been drawn into research on religion and health, that it's probably best if I state where I am on that particular issue in terms of religion. I think I'm pretty cool because I don't have any agenda in this regard. I do not attend religious services. I read religious materials a lot. I don't go out and commune with nature and think that that is my spiritual life, but I read a tremendous amount from various religions and try to really kind of get from my own mind at the essence of what they're saying. But I don't sit in a pew. I don't get up early Sunday morning and go to services. And I really, when I started this particular research, I really didn't care what the research showed. It didn't matter to me whether we showed that religion did not have any effect on health. Even then, I couldn't believe that it would harm health, actually. But I sit in a sociology department, and I think the social sciences are probably the most intolerant of religion. I can remember very well a faculty meeting in which we were congregating before actually starting the business at hand, and one of my colleagues, made a joke about fundamentalist Christians. And being the person I am, I said, gee, it's kind of interesting. We're too sophisticated to make blatantly racist or sexist jokes, but I guess fundamentalist Christians are fair game, huh? This did not go over well. They did not like that comment. And but I think it speaks a lot as to what really the view of the social sciences are. They've been quite resistant overall. There are pockets that are not, but overall, the people in the social sciences have been quite resistant to thinking that religion could be good for anybody in any way. And so I did not enter with that particular feeling. I entered very agnostic, so to speak. So and I think it's good to maintain a sense of humor. I will remember from one talk that I gave about especially the strong findings that religious participation is related to longevity, that a gentleman in the audience raised his hand and said, okay, about 8 years longer if you attend religious services once a week. He said, how much of those 8 years are spent sitting in a pew? And so, I think it is good to maintain somewhat of a sense of humor about these things as well. But you often scratch the surface and people have very, very strong feelings about this topic, both positive and negative. I've never studied a topic where there's my fundamentalist mother who says, why would anybody study that? Of course religion is good for your health. What do you mean? I can't believe they're paying you to do that. And then there are the people who are, why would anybody study that? Everybody knows it's archaic, it's bad for society. Look what's been done, da da da. So I think one of the best things people can bring to this topic is an openness to the findings, whatever they may be. I'm going to pretty much just give you my paper. You may have read it, may have not. Hopefully, actually I hope you haven't, because I've kind of shot my wad on that particular paper and am going to follow it pretty closely in what I say here today. All right. Research on the topic of religion and health has experienced incredible growth over the past 30 years or so. It really is quite incredible. In the mid and late 1980s, Jeff Levin published several foundational review articles summarizing what was known about the links between religion and health. And he found that there was a kind of amazing amount of research out there that was relevant to that topic. Those articles were directly responsible for the resurrection of scientific interest in the links between religion and health. His contributions spurred interest in multiple disciplines, as has been said this morning, including public health, the medical sciences, and the social and behavioral sciences. As a simple exercise in preparing for today, I used the ISI Web of Science to search for articles using the one phrase, the key words, religion and health, before and after 1986. In 1984, 85, 86, those were the times I think that Jeff's pioneering exploration were really having an impact. This procedure yielded a total of 62 articles before 1986 and 2,977 articles since 1987. This is clearly not an accurate count. I'm not claiming it's accurate. There are at least two reasons to know that it isn't accurate. First, older journals are less likely to than recent ones to be available online. And second, as Jeff pointed out in his reviews, a substantial amount of earlier work that reported associations between religious participation and health did not focus on those particular relationships. Nonetheless, it seems obvious that there has been a great increase in research on religion and health. Despite what Tim so kindly said, I do not define myself as a core contributor to the field of religion and health, although I've had the privilege of collaborating with many of the key figures in the field. My former students and mentees, who include Chris Ellison, Jeff, Harold Koenig, Keith Metter, and Mark Music, are stellar scholars in the field. My major role as both a collaborator in some studies and as a reviewer of others has been to integrate and critique findings in the field and to ask my collaborators and the field more generally questions along the lines of, what about this? Have you thought about that? And that's the approach I'm taking here. I'm going to address two primary themes. First, I will express the opinion that over the last decade, and despite the steady volume of research on religion and health, the field has become largely stagnant. An opinion with which others may disagree. Second, I will describe aspects of religion and health that I believe merit increased attention and may have the potential to kind of re-energize the field. In 2000, the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology devoted an issue to the topic of classical human strengths. In that issue, Dave Larson, Harold Koenig, Mike McCullough, and I had a paper that was titled Spirituality and Health, What We Know, What We Need to Know. As the title implies, this article reviewed the state of the science with regard to the relationships between religion or spirituality and health, including the hypothesized mechanisms that might explain these relationships, and we outlined some high priority issues for future research. Quoting directly from the paper, we concluded that, quote, although the effect sizes are moderate, there typically are links between religious practices and reduced onset of physical and mental illnesses, reduced mortality, and the likelihood of recovery from or adjustment to physical and mental illness, unquote. We examined the hypothesized mechanisms that might account for the typically positive relationships between religion and health and that had received substantial investigation at the time of the review. The first hypothesis was that religious participation leads to larger or higher quality social support systems, which in turn foster good health. The second hypothesis was that religious participation leads to better health behaviors, which in turn promote health. And the third hypothesis was that certain psychological resources, such as self-esteem and sense of control, mediate the relationships between religion and health. we concluded that both individually and as a set, these proposed mechanisms explained relatively little of the religion-health relationship, and that was a surprise. I submit to you that if we were to review the research on religion and health today, more than a decade later, our conclusions would be largely the same. Certainly, there would be a larger base of research to review, and certainly several new or expanded topics would be included. Among them are a small body of research that compares the effects of church-based and secular social support, another small body of research reporting that religious doubts and struggles are associated with poorer health, and a growing body of research that links religious involvement with biological markers of risk for illness, including measures of immune and endocrine function. Nonetheless, I believe that our conclusions would be essentially the same. Yes, there is evidence that multiple dimensions of religious or spiritual experience are related to favorable health outcomes, but we still know little about the whys and hows that account for those relationships. So what will it take to move the field from the rather stagnant position in which I think it now rests? Well, rather than investing in several dozen more studies that examine social support and health behaviors as mediators of the links between religion and health, I contend that we need to develop and pursue both new and understudied aspects of these links. What I'm going to turn to now and spend the rest of my time talking about is some of the directions that I think might yield important and interesting results. I'll begin with the more obvious spin-offs of existing research and then move to increasingly novel issues about which less is known. The first spin-off concerns how we think about and measure religious involvement. It is a truism in the field that religious involvement is multidimensional and that specific dimensions may be differentially important for specific health outcomes. A related question is whether engaging in multiple dimensions of religious participation yields greater benefits than engaging in one or two. A large body of research has examined the effects of multiple dimensions of religious experience in regression analyses in which the dimensions compete with each other, and the results estimate the effect of each dimension on health net of the other effects of the other variables. The typical finding is that not all dimensions of religious experience remain significant, and the ones that do are viewed as more relevant to the health outcome. I understand the logic of this kind of analysis. Indeed, I've co-authored several papers that take that approach. This analytic approach is congruent with the desire to identify just what it is about religious involvement that affects health. From another perspective, however, why would we want to study the extent to which religious dimensions compete with each other? Do we really think that there are winners and losers out there in terms of religious experience? Now, some researchers create a summary measure of religious involvement, adding up the number of dimensions of religious experience that study participants report. Do you attend services? Do you read sacred texts? Do you pray? I'm not aware of any studies that carefully compare results based on summary scales with those measured based on measuring separate dimensions of religious experience. My sense, however, is that both methods yield compatible findings, and neither approach explains substantially more variation in health outcomes than the other. They're pretty comparable so far as I can tell. What if, however, participation in multiple dimensions of religion operate multiplicatively rather than additively? Perhaps participating in multiple dimensions of religious experience exponentially affects health. I know of one study by Parker and colleagues that tested interactions among multiple forms of religious experience. The results indicated that the religious dimensions had both main and interactive effects on depression. That was the outcome. Relatively little was said about the interactions in the article, however, beyond the fact that they, quote, complicated the results, unquote. This is an important finding that merits additional effort on other samples with various health outcomes. I also find it a more logical approach to understanding the joint effects of different dimensions of religious involvement than putting them in competition with each other. A second spin-off concerns what, following the lead of a classic study by Palmer, I like to call divine support, or what the literature generally refers to as a personal relationship with God. As I reviewed my stacks of papers and abstracts to get ready for this talk, I was impressed by the strong associations between reporting a close personal relationship with a higher power and a variety of health outcomes. The association emerges vividly in several qualitative studies and has been observed in survey-based research as well, including a study by Jeff Levin. Now, not that I think that dimensions of religious experience should compete against each other, but for those who still believe they should, I'll note that in the quantitative studies I've seen, reporting a close personal relationship with God is significantly associated with a variety of health outcomes with other dimensions of religious experience controlled. Other studies find that a close personal relationship with God can compensate for loneliness and for insecure attachment styles which make human relationships difficult. Despite these intriguing results, only a small number of studies have actually examined divine support or the sense that one has a close personal relationship with God. I think this dimension of religious experience merits additional inquiry, and not only because research findings to date have been consistent and strong. It appears that humans can obtain meaningful support from a number of invisible sources. One example is the phenomenon of imaginary friends during childhood. Research evidence, I didn't have imaginary friends during childhood, but since I've read a little bit about it, I wish I had. Research evidence is mixed, with some studies finding no significant differences between children with and without imaginary friends, and other studies reporting that having imaginary friends is associated with increased optimism, self-confidence, and creativity. Importantly, no study has observed negative effects from having imaginary friends. Another example is referred to in the literature as talking to the dead or continuing bonds with the dead. It is very common for bereaved individuals to talk to their departed loved ones. Again, research to date, although not plentiful, suggests that maintaining relationships with deceased significant others brings substantial comfort and is meaningful. Support from non-visible sources also dovetails with the well-established empirical finding that perceiving one has a high-quality support network is more strongly and consistently related to positive health outcomes than actually using and receiving assistance from significant others. We're all better off if we think it would be there, but don't put it to the test. There is considerable discussion of transcendence in writings about spirituality in particular. And I generally get the impression that by transcendence, they're referring to some overarching cosmic experience in which the material world is replaced by a world that is beyond limitations of time and place. Undoubtedly, some individuals do have such far-reaching transcendental experiences. But it's also likely that there are smaller, more bounded forms of transcendence, and receiving support from invisible sources may be one of them. Thus, I strongly encourage further research on the experience of having a close personal relationship with God or a higher power and its implications for health. A final spin-off is what in my discipline is called contextual effects. Contextual effects research focuses on the extent to which and ways in which social, cultural, and geographic settings affect individual outcomes over and above the effects of individual level predictors. Consider poverty as an example. We can measure poverty at the individual level, separating study participants into those who do and do not have incomes below the poverty level. But we can also identify poor neighborhoods, that is, areas where a large proportion of residents have incomes below the poverty line. We know that individuals whose incomes are at or below the poverty line are more likely to have poor health than those who have higher incomes. Known that for decades. The crux of contextual effects research is to ask whether living in a poor neighborhood increases the likelihood of poor health over and above the effects of personal poverty. By and large, we can say that it does. That the combination of being poor and living in a poor neighborhood is associated with worse health than being poor and living in a neighborhood that is not especially poor. As applied to religion and health, the issue is whether religious contexts promote health over and above individuals' personal religious experience. Religious contexts can include congregations, neighborhoods, cities or counties, and even societies, any of which may affect health. The research based on religious contextual effects is very small, and most of it focuses on adolescence and the extent to which religious context affects rates of delinquency and other behavioral problems. And indeed, based on the small research available, both the presence of religious schools and religiously homogeneous neighborhoods appear to reduce rates of delinquency. I think that's pretty amazing, pretty astounding. Jaffe and colleagues authored a study I found especially well done, and their study was not of adolescents. They found that individuals, adults living in religiously homogeneous neighborhoods had lower mortality rates than those living in religiously heterogeneous neighborhoods after controlling on a wide range of individual and other contextual variables. I'll take an aside here a little bit. We have such a negative association with the word segregation. We view that as a highly kind of negative word. You know, we don't want to promote segregation. However, there's a fair amount of research on different topics that shows that kind of being surrounded by people like you is good for you. It's true in terms of age. Older adults do better when they live in environments that are largely comprised of other older adults than they do in more age-diverse neighborhoods. So we've kind of adopted this language in social sciences where we don't want to say age segregation is good, because we never want to say segregation's a good thing. So we talk about age heterogeneous and age homogeneous neighborhoods, and we see that also in the very nascent research on religious contexts where they talk about religious homogeneity versus religious heterogeneity. But the concept is kind of the same, and I think it says something interesting about the political connotations of various words and what they mean. But there's pretty strong scientific evidence that some kinds of, quote, segregation, unquote, are actually pretty good for us in terms of general well-being, happiness, and that kind of thing, and health. All right, going on, after that aside, I'm not too good on my slides. It is a fair statement, I think, to say that most research on religion and health has focused on disaggregation, including efforts to determine what dimension or dimensions of religious experience are responsible for the generally positive relationships between religion and health. As I stated earlier, I understand the logic of these efforts, which are compatible with the search for mechanisms. It's also possible, however, that these kinds of studies will not, and perhaps cannot, identify the specific pathways between religious and spiritual practices and health. That is, religious experience may be a package in which the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. As an example, consider the fact that attending religious services has stronger associations with many health outcomes than other dimensions of religious experience. Attending religious services is the dimension of religious involvement that is the most public and that involves participation in a faith community. Thus, this finding has been music to sociologists' ears and is compatible with the hypothesis that social support is a primary pathway from religion to health. Unfortunately, research, rejects this notion. Research has shown no research has shown that social support explains a large proportion of variance in health outcomes. Church-based support, however, differs from other sources of support in ways that have not been empirically investigated. I suggest that church-based support, that you not measure it by saying how many of the people who help you when you have problems are members of your congregation. I suggest that church-based support is distinctive beyond who it is that provides assistance when needed. Church-based support is more permanent and more normatively governed than other sources of support. Most individuals have highly committed personal networks of family and friends, but those networks are at risk of being lost in a way that a community of faith is not. Some of us outlive or outlast our personal support networks. Communities of faith generally continue. Some of our most intimate relationships may be with congregation members, but even if they die or move away, the congregation itself continues. Helping norms also are relevant. Social support received from family and friends rests on norms about helping others that probably vary widely across relationships. For example, friends will typically have set boundaries on this kind of social amount and kinds of social support they will provide that are different from those taken by spouses or children. Most congregations, at least those in Protestant churches, have strong norms emphasizing mutual support and helping church members in need. Committees are formed to visit the sick, tend to the bereaved, and perform other forms of assistance. Am I my brother's keeper is a rhetorical question in most congregations. Of course they are. That's the answer to that. But outside of congregations, that question is answered in multiple ways, and not always in ways that increase social support to individuals. This is a simple example, but hopefully it illustrates the point that congregations are communities and religion is a social institution. Moreover, I believe that religion is a unique social institution that provides its participants with a variety of goods and services, to borrow an economic term, which other institutions do not. Other major social institutions, including the economy, politics, education, and so forth, have critically important functions. They do not, however, fill the same functions that religion does. Spurred by Putnam's Bowling Alone, both scholars and the public now realize that American communities do not offer the integration and collective effort that they once did, or at least that people thought they once did. Faith communities are arguably the closest thing to effective communities that exist in American society. Thus, I'm not convinced that we need to dissect religious experience to demonstrate its importance for health. A better way to understand the effects of religion may be to compare it to other institutions, other social institutions. Like most disciplines, where am I? Oh, I did all that. Like most disciplines, my discipline, sociology, covers a lot of territory. One major branch of sociology is symbolic interactionism, or it's called SI. A core tenet of SI is that social life is based on meanings that are shared among individuals and within groups and cultures. SI scholars posit that interaction is an ongoing, never-ending search for meaning. SI theorists also distinguish between meaning-making and meaning-taking. Meaning-taking occurs when individuals use existing elements of their cultures, both material artifacts and intangible elements such as values and beliefs, to make sense of the world and how it operates. A large proportion of meaning-taking occurs through routine socialization, during which individuals are taught the primary shared meanings in their society or subgroup. Although we learn the most about shared social meanings during childhood, meaning-taking occurs throughout the life course as we are exposed to new for us, but pre-existing knowledge. Meaning-making occurs when we encounter novel situations or try to understand things for which the culture seems to provide little pre-existing knowledge. In these situations, individuals or groups will create new meanings. An assumption of sociology in general and SI in particular is that lack of meaning is cognitively, emotionally, and even physically uncomfortable. It is not an accident that the inability to find meaning in life is a symptom of clinical depression. Now, you're going to have to excuse my language on this, but it's a perfect example. Jim Morrison, also dates me, lead singer for The Doors, a popular rock group in the late 60s and early 70s, was known in part for his proclamation that, quote, "Life's a bitch and then you die," unquote. Clearly, Jim Morrison had a crisis of meaning. Humans find some issues more difficult to imbue with meaning than others. Questions such as why people die, why some people must suffer incredible physical pain or mental anguish, and even for some, why should we get up in the morning, can pose major challenges to meaning. Individuals who experience crises in meaning are generally not productive members of society. In addition, they suffer intensely. One of the functions of our social institutions is to provide meaning where it would be otherwise problematic. Providing meaning about life's tragedies and other unanswerable questions is a key function of religion. And although secularization has eroded religious authority to some extent, I believe that no other social institution comes close to religion in providing meaning about important issues that otherwise seem meaningless. Aaron Antonovsky, a medical sociologist, devoted his life to studying psychosocial factors that promote health and well-being, rather than those that harm health. Much of his research was performed in Israel and involved Holocaust survivors who had relocated there after World War II. He originated the concept of sense of coherence, which he believed to be a critically important resource for health. In his formulation, the sense of coherence has three components. The first is comprehensibility, which he defines as a belief that things happen in an orderly way and a sense that you can understand the events in your life. The second component is manageability, which is a belief that you have the skills or the support or the resources necessary to take care of things, that things are largely in your control. The third component is meaningfulness, or the belief that life is really worth living and that there are good reasons to care about what happens to self and others. According to Antonovsky, meaningfulness is the most important component. If a person believes that there is no reason to persist, to confront challenges, and to survive, if they have no meaning, they will have no motivation to comprehend or manage events. Antonovsky also developed a scale to measure sense of coherence, including subscales of the three components. A rather large body of research, most of it, however, performed in Europe rather than the US, reports that a sense of coherence is significantly related to positive health outcomes. Not all research, however, finds these relationships. Despite the characteristics of his research participants, Antonovsky made only passing references to the role that religion might play in fostering a sense of coherence. Other investigators report positive correlations between religious involvement and sense of coherence, but these relationships have not been explored in depth. I highly recommend additional research on the linkages among religion, sense of coherence, and health. I'd also like to see the field delve even further into constellations of belief that may be important for health. As a segue to discussing constellations of belief, I'd like to mention a recent article by Jeff Levin titled "How Faith Heals, a Theoretical Model." I view this as one of the best, if not the best, paper on the links between religion and health published in the last 5 years. Jeff does a wonderful job of integrating a very large body of research in an innovative and useful way. I was especially impressed with his integration of research on several psychological constructs that are related to both health and religious involvement. These constructs include hope, learned optimism, positive illusions. I love positive illusions. I wouldn't get through life without positive illusions. And opening up or trust. These psychological constructs might well form the nucleus of a system of beliefs in which, again, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I do take issue to some degree, however, with part of Jeff's magnificent paper. After reviewing the psychological constructs, Jeff tackles the question of how and why they might explain the links between religion and health. Jeff states, quote, "Two related topics come into play. The first of these is the familiar, if mysterious, idea of placebos. The second is the quickly emerging scientific field of psychoneuroimmunology, or PNI. Later in that paragraph, Jeff says, and you can read it for yourself, if one does not wish to pursue a more earnest scientific investigation of putative health, faith health, or religion health linkages, then the simplest course is to attribute the whole phenomenon to the placebo effect or to PNI without further detail or explanation. Such an approach does not do this subject justice." In the remainder of the paper, Jeff develops a typology of mechanisms, the study of which might in fact do this subject justice and pinpoint the mechanisms that link religion to health. Thus, Jeff argues that an important challenge for religion and health research is to kind of go down to increasingly specific aspects of life that might be pathways from religion to health. I have no problem with that as one area of scientific inquiry on religion and health. But actually, I'm more enthusiastic about going up a few levels of abstraction. In particular, I recommend examining structures of belief, or more accurately, meta-theories, about the status of the world to understand the links between religion and health. A term used in both scientific research and philosophical writings to refer to these systems of belief, or meta-theories, is the term worldviews. Rowley and colleagues describe worldviews or belief systems especially well, I think. I love the first sentence. Belief systems are not beliefs. Rather, belief systems are more basic in the psychological thinking process. They are the patterns of thinking that form the basis for attitude formation, knowledge, interpretations, beliefs, and personality. These relatively unconscious methods of interpretation allow people to attribute meaning to phenomena, and they help people form an understanding of the world around them. Although there is as yet no firm empirical evidence supporting it, I contend that religious participation tends to promote worldviews or belief structures that are conducive to health, that are in fact more conducive to health than many competing worldviews. Sense of coherence may be a worldview or part of a larger belief structure that fosters health. Any viable worldview must encompass or apply to the wide range of phenomena that individuals encounter and to which they must respond. The three components of sense of coherence seem to meet that need. Fascinating research being conducted by Jonathan Haidt and his colleagues, psychologists at the University of Virginia, provides another example of what can be learned by studying belief systems. Haidt and his colleagues are interested in the links between politics and morality. They studied in depth the speeches and literature produced by hundreds of politicians during the 2004 and 2008 presidential elections. They extracted from these sources statements that had clear moral or ethical content and studied how they differed across both socioeconomic classes and political philosophies. They concluded that both liberals and conservatives are morally driven, but that they inhabit different moral universes. After immersing themselves in thousands of pages of political rhetoric, Haidt et al. Identified 5 moral principles into which all morally relevant political rhetoric seemed to fit. They are, number 1, harm care. And typical of that was the belief that it's wrong to hurt people, it's good to relieve suffering. Number 2 is fairness, reciprocity. And typical beliefs are justice and fairness are good. People have rights that need to be upheld by individuals and social institutions. That sounds like promoting religious freedom to me, but 3, in-group loyalty. Allegiance, loyalty, and patriotism are good. 4, authority, respect. Social order is necessary to human life and must be honored. And 5, purity, sanctity. Certain aspects of life are sacred and should be kept pure. Haidt et al. Found that people from across the political spectrum endorsed all 5 categories of moral and ethical principles, but weighted their importance very differently. Indeed, a moral profile can be constructed for any individual based on the weights that he or she assigns to the 5 moral principles. These profiles can be aggregated and compared across political and other groups. Not surprisingly, Haidt and colleagues found that liberals and conservatives differed greatly on the weight they attributed to these moral principles. Quintessential liberals highly weight harm care and fairness, reciprocity. They give almost no weight to purity, sanctity. They are not morally offended if individuals burn American flags, express disdain for the military, or advocate overthrowing the government. Conservatives, in contrast, weigh the last 3 moral principles much more heavily than the first 2. They value social order and its authorities, even at the expense of individual rights. They certainly don't advocate wholesale trampling of individual rights, but they clearly prefer social order, even if it means that some societal members suffer as a result. The bumper sticker that reads, "Dissent is the highest form of patriotism," is a sacrilege to right-wing politicians. For Haidt, who is, I didn't do my conservatives, for Haidt, who has a fascinating blog and a book on this topic that will be released in March of 2012, the major problem in political debates is that neither liberals nor conservatives recognize or acknowledge that both sides are operating on moral or ethical grounds. Liberals typically view conservatives as out of touch with modern life at best and ignorant at worst. Conservative view liberals as ungrounded, reckless, and willing to dismantle order for chaos. Dan Mcadams, a psychologist at Northwestern University, is performing in-depth interviews with members of different religious denominations. He asked questions about their moral principles, including the trade-offs they would make if these principles were in conflict. He's using Haight's typology of moral principles to organize their responses. Although most of this research is not yet ready for publication, he reports that he's finding strong and predictable differences in the moral profiles for individuals from different religious denominations. One paper examining how moral principles are related to the content of individuals' prayers was recently published, which I found very interesting. Okay, I'm coming to the end here. Although they don't use the term, it seems to me that Haight and colleagues revealed worldviews, distinctive constellations of moral beliefs that differ across individuals and groups. We know that these worldviews are related to political philosophy. These worldviews may or may not be related to health, but there's emerging evidence that they are related to religious affiliation. I strongly encourage research that links worldviews or systems of belief to both religious involvement and to health. The final issue I will address is even more abstract than worldviews. There is no definitive phrase for the phenomena I will be describing, so I will use the term cultural ethos, which is one of many terms in the literature. Cultural ethos is by its nature diffuse and abstract, but at heart it refers to the underlying paradigm by which people understand the world around them. Scholars from a wide range of academic disciplines have participated in the challenge to identify the core paradigm at various points in history. In general, scholars discuss the cultural ethos characteristic of three large periods of time: the pre-modern world, the modern world, and the postmodern world. There are no hard and fast definitions of these eras, although a majority of authors would not quarrel with defining the pre-modern world as the 14th through the 18th centuries, the modern world as the 19th and most of the 20th century, and the postmodern world as the late 20th and 21st century. Scholars also largely agree on the cultural ethos characteristic of each period. The overarching cultural ethos of the pre-modern world was religion. The counterpart in the modern world was science and technology. For the postmodern world, scholars argue that there is no unified cultural paradigm because humankind has come to understand that there are no universals, that knowledge is constructed, not discovered, and that there is no reality that is not constructed and contextually situated. Postmodernist thinkers believe that science will cease to be the defining or dominant source of knowledge in the world. Science will certainly exist, they claim, but it will sit amid many other systems of obtaining knowledge. Indeed, many postmodernist scholars believe that science has already lost much of its respect. For example, a 1995 survey of high school students in the US, Britain, and Australia included a series of statements about science. Students were asked to rate the extent to which they agreed or disagreed with each. 63% of the students agreed that science is a tool used to concentrate wealth, power, and privilege among the elite rather than to help humankind more broadly. 76% endorsed the statement that government primarily uses science to monitor and control people rather than strengthen and empower them. Perhaps we should not be surprised if science loses its luster. An author named Oswald Spengler foresaw the loss of faith in science in a book titled The Decline of the West, which was published in 1918 and was reprinted in 1991. Spengler predicted that by the end of the 20th century, science would lose its role as the primary source of cultural knowledge, and a resurgence of irrationality would become the dominant cultural paradigm. It took me about 50 pages of the book to realize that for Spengler, irrationality was a synonym for religion. One of my favorite authors on this topic is Richard Eckersley, a professor at Australian National University. He's troubled by the assumptions of postmodernists and sees both religion and science as important social institutions, but he also thinks that each of them must serve humankind better than they do now. Here is what he says about science. Scientific knowledge does transcend its cultural context. It does advance in a way that is unique. But scientific knowledge is never the whole truth or an absolute immutable truth. Science must be changed. While remaining rigorous, science must become intellectually less arrogant and culturally better integrated. Science must become more tolerant of other forms of reality, other ways of seeing the world. He's a little less specific about what religion should do to do a better job, but these are his words. The new religions would transcend rather than confront the powerful, individualizing and fragmenting forces of postmodernity. At the most fundamental, transcendent level is spiritual meaning, a sense of having a place in the universe. Religion offers something more. It represents the broadest and deepest form of connectedness. It is the most subtle and therefore most easily corrupted, yet perhaps the most powerful. It is the only form of meaning that transcends our personal circumstances, social situation, and the material world, and so can sustain us through the trouble and strife of moral existence. Does cultural ethos in all its abstractness and fuzziness affect health? I believe it does, although I cannot provide empirical support for that conclusion. Consider two quotes from so-called hard scientists who seem to epitomize the dichotomy in postmodern thinking. The first is from Richard Dawkins, a well-known British biologist and fervent atheist. He says, "In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to be hurt, others are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but a pitiless indifference." Yikes. That's a guy I wouldn't want to chat with for very long, to be honest with you. He's a real downer. Now consider a quote from Paul Davies, an Australian physicist. He's also been in the US, so I'm not sure what he really is, but this is what he has to say anyway. "The true miracle of nature is to be found in the ingenious and unswerving lawfulness of the cosmos, a lawfulness that permits complex order to emerge from chaos, life to emerge from inanimate matter, and consciousness to emerge from life. The universe is a coherent, rational, elegant, and harmonious expression of a deep and purposeful meaning." Now there's a man I'd enjoy talking to. Both of these worldviews exist in our postmodern world. It's not that their adherents go through life expressing themselves in the terms exactly that these guys do, but it's that those perspectives act as filters through which everything that they see, feel, and experience passes. And I believe that they affect health. If I internalized Richard Dawkins' philosophy, I would see no reason to get out of bed in the morning. I would feel helpless. I would feel hopeless. My only hope would be that randomness made me one of the lucky ones. And if I experienced good fortune, how could I take any pleasure in it if it was in fact randomly generated? In contrast, Davies' perspective makes me want to preserve, nurture, and celebrate life. It makes me want to be part of and contribute to the miraculous entity that we call the universe. It excites me. It energizes me. It makes me want to take care of myself and others. At the same time that it empowers me, it assures me that I exist in a universe that is benevolent and purposeful. I believe that religion, more than any other social institution, encourages worldviews that the universe is benevolent and purposeful, that life does have meaning even when we suffer, and that life and health are to be celebrated, respected, and a source of gratitude. Religion may not be the only way to that worldview or cultural ethos, but at minimum, it is a major pathway to it. Measuring worldviews and performing research that links them to health will not be easy or straightforward. The challenges aren't only methodological, although those are pretty concerning. We also lack theories to guide us in conceptualizing alternate worldviews and identifying their boundaries. Once the scientific community has at least minimally adequate ways of measuring worldviews and estimating their relationships to health, many other tasks will remain, including identifying the sources of worldviews, whether they be religious socialization, individual experience, political morals, and determining the extent to which worldviews are malleable. I certainly don't have all or even many of the answers about how we might usefully go about identifying worldviews and their consequences. But I believe that efforts to do so would make a vital contribution to our understanding of the links between religion and health at a level of reality that does full justice to the power and ultimate grace of the human spirit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. You know, it's funny, with different versions of PowerPoint, somehow colors changed a little. I had made my background Duke blue in honor of Linda, and it got transformed into Northwestern purple, which would thrill my wife Lee, who is a Northwestern grad. But so what I want to give here is kind of, I guess my role is as a respondent. So I would like to give kind of my sense of what Linda had to say and my response to it and critique, and then I'll have some remarks of my own. You know, I've got to say, you know, Linda in her talk said some nice things about me and mentioned that I'm a former student, and whenever I hear her, you know, mention me among her former students, I'm always a little bit embarrassed, because to say you're a former student of somebody means that, you know, you were trained by that person. And Linda indeed trained Chris Ellison and trained Mark Music and others. I was simply a college student, a religion major, who took a class with her my senior year, because I had to. I was closed out of the one I was supposed to take, and then didn't see her or talk to her again for many years. And the fact that all these years later she's willing to claim me, it's just, I mean, sincerely, it's just an overwhelming honor. I don't know what I have done to deserve her wanting to claim me. In fact, I want to, you know, I'm not a sociologist, despite what people think. I'm an epidemiologist, trained in biomedical science and epidemiology and public health. I'm not a sociologist, but it's just, I've worked with sociologists. Actually, Linda may or may not know this story. This is funny. When after getting my public health degree, actually, I'm both a Dookie and a Tar Heel, which I know bothers Linda, being such a, in fact, one of the greatest moments of my life, I was out on Franklin Street in 1983 when Michael Jordan hit the shot to beat Georgetown. So, so talk about, you know, religious, you can have competing religions. I am both a Dookie and a Tar Heel. But I went off to the University of Texas Medical Branch, the UT Medical Branch, in '83, and to get my PhD, and did my work in epidemiology under a well-known social demographer named Kyriakos Kokos Markides. I was his first student. And I didn't find this out till years later. I was talking to him, we said, Kokos, why did you accept me into the program? I mean, I was a religion major, and I had a very different background than the other kids that came in the program and were sociologists or psychologists. And he said, I looked at your transcript as an undergraduate and saw that you had taken a class with Linda George, and this was exact quote. So he said, so I figured I could use you. So, true story. So in a way, I owe everything to Linda. Okay. You know, just to go back a slide, I'm calling this an epidemiologist perspective. I'm not saying an epidemiologic perspective, because I don't purport to, I've always joked I'm probably the most marginal epidemiologist in the world. So this is my perspective and not everybody else's. Although what I want to do is try to present kind of the way that as an epidemiologist I would approach a topic. And I think that will help kind of frame my remarks and frame the direction I think the field needs to go, as far as the kind of conceptual, theoretical, and especially methodological ways that we need to engage this, field. So, first thing is a kind of a, you know, restatement of Linda's key points. And so this is more or less what I take from it. the two things that jumped out, and she said it in these words: the field has become stagnant, and new topics can potentially re-energize the field. And of course, I mean, I don't know. You don't want to say anything settled, but I can say I agree 1,000% with both of those statements, and I don't know how anybody that's done work in this field for 20 or 25 or 30 years would think otherwise. The field absolutely has become stagnant. We're just doing the same thing over and over and over, at least from the social and the epidemiologic side, and that we definitely need new topics. We need to expand our focus of the ways that we engage religion, and when I say religion, I mean that in the broadest sense of the term: religion, spirituality, faith, prayer, whatever. But just we need to engage this domain of human life in a better way than we've done, and we need to try to answer some of the how and why questions. I'll mention this later. We've been really good on the what. Typical epidemiology, this thing's related to this thing by person, place, and time. But the kind of what does this mean question, we've done a miserable job. And I've been writing for probably actually almost 25 years on my take on what some of this how and why is, and yet still it's not being done. For the most part. Another thing that Linda talked about are some of these spin-offs of existing research. I think she's right on. The need to reconceptualize religious involvement. The point about looking at things multiplicatively. That's great, and that's actually not something that I've heard gone into in other places. And I think that this is something that methodologically the social sciences are equipped to do, especially with the types of logistic modeling and other things that we do, and our ability to do a structural equation modeling, confirmatory factor analysis. Anyway, for people who don't know what that means, that doesn't matter. Just a technical point. But the idea of us looking at things in tandem, together, multiplicatively, and so on, yeah, absolutely we can do that. We do that on other topics. Why can't we do this here? And I think actually, in a way, probably one of the things that inhibits us, and I see this a lot when I go, especially to medical meetings on this topic, there's a sense that, there's a sense that when people study this, that somehow the reason that people are engaging this topic is they want to, it's just purely theoretical. You just want to understand if religion has something to do with health and why, and that we're on some sort of a mission, and we have some sort of a focus on some religious dimension, some pet dimension. For me, as an epidemiologist, it has absolutely nothing to do with why this field interested me. I was a graduate student in public health, and it's just a long story I won't get into, but I discovered some of this literature out there almost about 30 years ago. And as a public health person, as an epidemiologist, I thought, wow, here's something that may potentially have an impact on population health, on rates of morbidity and mortality. As a public health person, I want to investigate this and see what it's about, see if there's literature out there, see what this means, and so on. I didn't have any agenda to prove that faith was good for you. I could, that wasn't my issue. I wasn't coming at it from that. I was coming at it as a biomedical person. At any rate, the other point, close personal relationships with God, divine support. I think it's a great idea. I read that Pollner piece in General Health and Social Behavior, whatever it was, 20-some years ago, and no one's ever really followed up to much of an extent. There has been a little bit of literature. Well, actually, ever since Stephen Post formed IROL with the Institute for Research on Unlimited Love with Templeton funding, and we did an RFP project, there's now begun to be kind of a field on altruistic love and in the broadest sense. And there have been some empirical papers. I've done a couple, as Linda mentioned. And now when one opens up handbooks of positive psychology, things like that, one's likely to see a chapter on love as much as one is on some of the other what Templeton would call classical sources of strength. But still, specifically in relation to health, to physical health or clinical measures of mental health, very, very little work. And then finally, contextual effects. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, any social scientist would want to see that. More novel issues. Linda then mentioned the idea of looking at communal dimensions and expressions of religiousness, and especially meaning and worldview coming from Antonovsky's sense of coherence. And so that was my take on what Linda had to say. And So now, my response and critique, I think I was asked in one of the earlier breaks, so I hope, do you agree with everything? Or I hope you have something critical to say. Well, I agree with most of it, but I do have some directions that I want to take that Linda did not bring up, and I think that'll be helpful. But first, this is where I would say I am in agreement with Linda, that this is a stagnant field. Yes, absolutely, and that there are new topics and directions needed. And actually, I'll tell an anecdote, because this is actually kind of humorous, kind of depressing at the same time. I was invited to speak at the GSA, the Gerontological meeting. I'm going to say it was 5 years ago. It was the year we were in Orlando. We were supposed to be in New Orleans, and then Katrina happened. At the last minute, we went to Orlando. So however many years ago that was, 5 or 6 years. And it was a panel on something like the future of religion and health within the aging field. And I guess did you speak? Okay, some of us spoke. So I was the token epidemiologist, like I usually am at these discussions. In a paper that I did with Linda Chatters, who's a colleague of mine, a longtime friend, and a psychologist, a health psychologist, or a developmental psychologist who does health and religion. At any rate, we came up with a paper, and one of the things we did in the paper that was really, really fun, I went into the literature, the religion health literature, and called out where I could all the various instances where over the years and decades people had come up with little agendas for future research. And at the end of any paper on a novel topic, it's like, here's my findings, here's the limitations of the study, and here's, agenda for future research. And I kind of gathered them all together and collated them, and I saw something very fast. And some of these were mine, and some of these were mine dating back decades. Some were by Harold Koenig, some were by Neil Krauss, who's a colleague of ours, and other people that have written on this topic. And what I did in the paper, I stepped through them, but in reverse chronological order for a purpose that you'll see in a minute. So as of mid to late 2000s, I had some of these agendas that people had, and they were all, we need more longitudinal research, we need better conceptualization, new constructs, we need to focus on mechanisms and so on. Then go back to the one prior to that. We need more longitudinal studies, we need better, and so on. And I tracked back through the 90s, back to the first one of these that I did back in the late 80s. I took it all the way back, and then finally I stopped this exercise. In 1968, there was a famous report, the Russell Sage Foundation report on aging. I think it was a Matilda White Riley report, and they even had a little bit about this, and it said, here's our agenda for future research. We need more longitudinal studies, we need better conceptualization, we need, to understand why. And it struck me, here it is, at the time, 30 years later, now 35, 40 years later, we're still bringing up the same things. Have we gotten any more? Yeah, Linda mentioned the literature review. I think how there were 62 studies, and then there were 2,000. Well, actually, the numbers are indeed much more than that. And when I did my first literature review on the topic in the mid 80s, I found somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 some papers. Most of these, though, were just simply epidemiologic studies looking at a morbidity or mortality rate of this or that and compared Jews and Catholics or something. So these weren't really studies of religion, but the number was somewhere between 200 and 250. When Harold Koenig, our colleague at Duke, did his first handbook of religion and health, 2001, the magic number was now up to 1,200 studies and another 400 essays, reviews, conceptual pieces, whatever. So the magic number is about 1,600. Well, there's a second edition of the handbook due out any week now, and I did the preface and Linda did the foreword, so we've seen kind of what's in there. Just in the last 10 years, there has been an additional, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 3,000, and so now we're well over 4,000. And I asked Harold, what about that just the number of essays and reviews, and he said he didn't know. He thought maybe another 11,000. And I have a colleague, David Rosemont, who's a psychologist, postdoc at Harvard, an Orthodox Jew who does a lot of work in this area, especially the interface of Jewish religion and health psychology. And he said he had done kind of he'd looked at the literature just on empirical studies of psychology within religion that broached, I don't know if you could call that mental health, but just included that and included other psychological constructs. Anyway, he said as far as he knows, if you include reviews and essays, maybe we're north of 20,000. So anyway, the point is, there's a huge amount of work, and if you go back 25 or 30 years, there wasn't a huge amount of work. This is all very contemporary, and it's past the point where I or anybody else can say they've read all of this. There was a point in the late 80s, I could say that I alone on the face of the earth, maybe Mike McCullough along with me, had read every single one of these things. That day is past. But at any rate, the idea that we need to not just keep doing the same old thing, that we need to move forward and we need to take a more creative view on this. Absolutely. We need to focus on the how and the why and not just the what. Again, we've done the what to death. Do we need another 10,000 studies that correlate single item attendance at church service with single item self-ratings of health? I don't know. I mean, I just think there's more creative things to look at. Broader, more creative efforts to assess spiritual life. The idea of relationship with God, communal aspects, meaning and worldview. The Antonovsky stuff fascinates me. I've written some on salutagenesis, and I just find this a fascinating topic. And so, I mean, what I'll say here, I agree with Linda without reservation. In fact, every one of these things on the list here are things that I have written about or touched on to some extent since I was a graduate student in the 1980s, and I agree. And it's kind of a continued frustration to me that these things still really aren't being done. And I've been going to meetings with Linda and Harold Koenig and Neil Krauss and Ken Parkman and sitting around tables, since probably the late 80s, and we have the same conversation. And so we're trying, but also I think it's important that we bring other people in the conversation. And one of the things that I've noticed, the core group in the religion and health area, for the most part, were sociologists. And really, Ken Parkman was one of the few people in psych that was involved. And yet, in the psych of religion area, there's this other area growing of people really focused on empirical research on religion over the years. We have two of the people here, Bob Emmons, Mike McCullough, Ken Parkman, others. And yet that world and our little sociology of health / aging world, and then me, were kind of separated. And yet all this incredible work's going on, and we need to bring people together. Now, I won't say that there's a huge amount of people in epidemiology doing this work. Bill Strawbridge at Berkeley, about the only other person I can think of that has done anything. But anything that brings people together across disciplines, because we all have a different way of looking at this stuff. So, and then also, and this is a touchy point to a lot of some people, we need to bring people from religious studies, pastoral care, theological studies into this conversation. Linda and I have both been on panels for NIH and elsewhere where we're charged with coming up with ways to define and assess religiosity and spirituality. And I think we're doing a real good job. We have people who are experts from Soch in that field and psych, but the people that form these groups and committees didn't think to have people involved that actually study religion or work with religion. And I think that's, if we were going to do, if psychosocial researchers were going to do a study of heart disease or some sort of cardiovascular outcome, and we're attempting to define things, at some point you'd want to run it by a cardiologist. Does this even make sense? And you wouldn't be funded to do that without that. But in our field, you have the kind of the funny situation of doctors and biomedical scientists and sociologists of religion and health psychologists sitting around and trying to come up with ways to measure religion. And that's okay, because fortunately most of us have specialized in the study of religion. But Keith Metter, our colleague, has just been really strong. We've got to get, and Keith is a doctor and a theologian and a public health person, so he gets it. And I just think it's very important that we widen the conversation. Well, at any rate, that's, I don't want to say much more about that. These are some things that I think would be really useful to focus on. These were things that Linda really talked explicitly about. I've been saying for many, many years that we need to focus more on religious experience. To me, that's so exciting, that's so interesting. I've done some writing on divine love, on transcendence. To me, the kind of the little buzz phrase I've been saying is that our measures of health, quote unquote, need to get, the whole hard-soft dichotomy, they need to get harder I'm really excited by efforts to look at the immune system markers and psychophysiological markers, and even, from an epidemiologic standpoint, things like mortality rates. And yet our religious measures need to get a little softer. And I don't mean there's no judgment around that, but things not so much focused on counting counting observable public behaviors. That's good. I have nothing. I won't ever say anything bad about that. But after 40 years or 30 years, we can kind of look interiorly a little bit more. And the whole idea of transcendence is fascinating. There's a growing literature within gerontology on transcendence. Not much in relation to religion and health. The whole relationship with God thing, I think, is very exciting. If you go back over time, some of Harold Koenig's work, now and again there will be a question in one of the surveys about being born again, but not a real emphasis. I think in David Rosemarin's work, there's a lot of information being collected from living, on Orthodox Jewish living, Torah observance. And I'm very interested in that. I think that's very neat. We ought to extend our consideration beyond the Christian communions to other monotheisms and non-Western traditions. And I have an interest in esoteric religion and the religious movements. They're a little harder to survey. As far as the other monotheistic faith traditions, there hasn't been a whole lot of interest in this topic empirically among Muslim researchers in this country or elsewhere. There has been a little. I now and again will see something. I saw a paper on well-being and religion from somebody in Egypt I think in a European journal, a little bit now and again. Now within Judaism, this actually interests me a lot, and since I came back I was in academia for years, got out, and have been back in for 2 years, and have focused my empirical work almost exclusively on Judaism. And I've been working closely with my friends at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. There's a thing called the Kaufman Institute on Judaism and Health, run by my friend Michelle Prince and founded by Rabbi Bill Cutter. And I have been engaging I've been going through all of the national and global data sets that I can find that have substantial Jewish populations and measures of religion and or health, and I've been starting to crank out papers. I've done this the last couple of years. I've got a paper. I used the data from Worldviews survey. So I have a paper that just came out in Mental Health, Religion, and Culture, which is a British psych and religion journal. I've used the Gallup World data. I've got a paper in press at Israel Journal of Psychiatry. It's just going to all these. My kind of, well, it won't be secret now, but my kind of double super secret Manhattan project is to do kind of a global, or at least a national, but potentially a global Jewish health survey. There's never been anything like that. But the first thing to do is work with some of these existing data sets in which there are substantial Israeli or diaspora or United States populations. And so I've been having a lot of fun. And amazingly, these data sets have the religion surveys typically maybe have 1 or 2 questions on health or happiness or life satisfaction. The health surveys maybe have 1 or 2 questions on religion. And so if you're creative enough, you can kind of piece together a series of papers. But this has been fun for me because, anyone that's looked at this field, as long as I have, as long as Linda has, knows that an overwhelming amount of research that has been done has been focused on populations in the United States. These have been largely, not as largely as people think, but largely Caucasian populations, largely Protestant populations, and mainline Protestant populations, not so much evangelical. So it's really the snapshot that we have of the relationship between religion and health doesn't even really look like, the people we've looked at doesn't even look like the rest of the United States, certainly. Then the thing that for me is a real pet issue, I like the idea of examining outcomes across the natural history of disease. And the folks here in medicine, they'll understand that. Overwhelmingly, the research that's out there now has been research focused on religion, again, religion in the broadest sense of the word, spirituality, religion, what faith, whatever, as correlates or predictors or as potential protective factors or risk factors against subsequent morbidity or mortality, or as correlates with health or mental health. We have done nothing, we've done very little to study healing. And sometimes in the literature, these words health, healing get interchanged. This is literature, most of the literature has been social surveys, or has been psychological experiments, or has been epidemiologic surveys. A lot of the work's been cross-sectional, most of it. most of these, in Epi we would call prevalence surveys. And so we're able to say, for example, for most of the social and Epi research, we've looked at large populations, looked at religious characteristics of people, and tried to identify how they are associated either with subsequent health outcomes or current health outcomes. This has nothing to tell us about religion curing or healing people that are sick. That's clinical research. That's research of healing. The way we do that, we study people who are sick, we do something, give them intervention, and then we look at an outcome and we look at to see if there's some type of change. So most of the research that's been done is as religion as a ostensibly preventive factor or protective factor in relation to health or well-being or life satisfaction or whatever. It hasn't been about religion curing people who are sick. There's been very little research. There's been that spate of very controversial, randomized, double-blinded controlled trials of prayer that I didn't even want to get into here. That's not even what I'm talking about. I'm talking about looking at, for example, the religiosity or spirituality of people in the hospital and then looking at outcomes like length of stay or recovery from illness. There's been very little of that out of the however many, whatever number we're going to pick, 4,000 or 11,000 or whatever, out of all those studies, very few. Some of these have come from Duke, and some of these have come from the psych literature, but there's very little. And as somebody in the biomedical area, we need more of that. And it's frustrating to me, and Linda's probably heard this anecdote. I did a trade book, a quote popular book. I don't know how popular it was, but it was not an academic book about 10 years ago called God, Faith, and Health. And it was going to be a survey of this epidemiologic literature. And the publisher came to me at one point and said, everything's great, but we're ready to go, but we just want to make a small change. Everywhere in the book where the word health was mentioned, we want to change it to healing. And I said, you can't do that. This is not about healing. And we want to change every instance of the word religion to spirituality. And we went back and forth, and basically I said, I offered to give my advance back in the book. And they said, okay. Well, so they left everything alone, but the subtitle was Exploring the Spirituality Healing Connection. Honest disclosure, there's very little on spirituality or healing anywhere in the book. And maybe in the scheme of things this doesn't matter, but to an epidemiologist this is very important. I'm very, very nervous about making any kind of medical claims for this research that don't exist. There shouldn't be medical claims made because this research does not speak to, for the most part, the idea of people are sick and suffering. Just go to church, increase your church rate or whatever, and your tumor will go away. Now, I'm all for that. If it turns out that that's true, I think it's wonderful. I would praise God for that. That's terrific. But research studies showing a higher or a lower rate of respiratory disease mortality in Seventh-day Adventists in California associated with more or less attendance at service, that does not tell us, go to church and your diabetes will get better. That's just two different questions. And again, I'm all for the other thing happening, but we need to study it first. We haven't done that. Okay, so before I get into the rest of the talk, this is what I've learned from Linda. This comes from a paper that Linda had at the gerontology meeting in '95. Social scientists studying the impact of religion on health are advised to begin engaging real epidemiologic concepts. And so Linda brought up things like exposure assessment, all the various things that epidemiologists study. I thought this was really neat, and frankly, I haven't told you this. It really galvanized me, and since that point, I've begun applying these ideas in several things. You have the references here. I've begun trying to look at, here's how I would call it, putting the epidemiology into the epidemiology of religion, trying to look at things like exposure assessment, looking at things the way that epidemiologists look at variables. And I think I have a slide later on that describes this. At any rate, what I want to do is just kind of step through how an epidemiologist would go about reconstructing this issue. So first thing, there's the idea of what, the what question, exposure assessment. Some of the things that we need to look at. Religion as a class of phenomena with different dimensions, with different inclusionary, exclusionary criteria, and different characteristics. We typically look at things just, we ask people, do you do this, do you do that? as epidemiologists, when we ask people, do you do this or do that, we ask, when did you start doing this? What's your history doing this? How long have you been doing this? And then you could add the word transmission here. You know, did somebody show you how to do this, and so on. Yet in studying religion, we typically don't do that because we study religion the way that we learn in the social and behavioral sciences. But in my field, I think we need to be doing more of this. And these are all things, again, that Linda said 16 years ago. Okay, here's another. We need to look at religious variables, spiritual variables, as well as health variables, and happiness, well-being variables. Typically what we do in epidemiology before we do a full-on analysis, we kind of look at things by aspects of person, place, or time. Is it more or less in this group of people or that, married people, men, women, different races or ethnicities, more in this nation or that nation? Are there chronological changes, temporal changes? I think the idea of taking advantage of things like the World Values Survey or the Gallup World Poll or the shared data of Europe and looking at these things across nations and so on, I think it's fabulous. And it doesn't restrict us to doing ecological analysis. We can look at the whole populations, but we need to broaden our look beyond just these little surveys we've done in this country. And then there's kind of the how question. And there's two dimensions of this. When Linda was talking about the mechanisms, what is it that mediates or moderates the relationship between religion and health? But then there's another issue, the one of kind of trajectories, how changes in levels of health or well-being are potentially functions of changes in religion over time. So this implies a more dynamic analysis. And you know, there's all kinds of methodologies. There's in gerontology, we do a lot of multi-wave panel analyses. There's event history. There's Cox proportional hazards. And you know, I was out of academia for years. I'm sure there's all kinds of new stuff now I don't even know about. If Mark Hayward were here, somebody like that, or Ken Mann, you know, we could ask them. But that's kind of the how question. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is a research agenda, and this is purely mine. This is, you know, you can disagree. You can have. Well, I'm sure when we talk this afternoon, we'll come up with different things. First is a conceptual question, and this is how an epidemiologist would characteristically go about this. If we want to look at health or happiness or any other dimension of physical or psychological well-being, we need to first try to tackle, you know, like an epistemic issue. You know, what is this thing? What does it mean? How do we assess it? Can we assess it? And so on. There are people out there, you know, the skeptical inquirer audience, that fellow Sloan that did a couple papers. It's impossible to assess, you know, religion, for example. It's simply impossible to do that. Well, hopefully people, when it comes to health and well-being, don't think it's impossible to assess these things. Although the idea, I'm sure some people think that you draw blood or something like that, you're assessing health. Well, in the social and behavioral sciences, we know that there are different domains and dimensions of health. There's functional, there's clinical or symptomatic domains, or subjective domain. And as far as well-being, I just know from my work as a postdoc under Jerzy Liang in Michigan back in the 80s, all the different dimensions and domains of well-being that have been studied, that have been scaled. Mood disorders, depression, anxiety, life satisfaction, congruence, happiness, mood tone, all affect balance, and so on. So there's a lot out there. But any study that we're going to do, we need to stop and say, okay, what are we looking at? Too many of these papers that are out there just say, have like religion and health or religion and well-being in the title. And each of these different domains and dimensions really is something presumably distinct with its own set of correlates and its own set of determinants and so on. Okay. Why? If we're going to study this, we need to ask, what is it about, what are the functions or expressions or manifestations of being religious and spiritual that have anything to do with health or with well-being or happiness? Are there mediators? Are there moderators? Does this relationship itself differ by religion? If there is a religion-health connection, is it indeed a respecter of religion? And if you look at the literature, the answer appears to be no. And for some people, that's very challenging. For this whole literature on double-blinded studies of prayer we aren't going to talk about. That's been incredibly challenging because about a quarter of these 200-some studies seem to show that there's some effect of absent or distant prayer, double-blinded, and so on. And when everybody just thought there was one study, the famous Bird study from 25 years ago in evangelicals and Catholics, people didn't know what it meant, but seemed to be okay with it. When all these other studies started coming out, looking at religious science practitioners and Native Americans and so on, people started running and screaming away from this literature. And there are reasons to run away screaming from the literature methodologically, but I just was always troubled. When it was just evangelical or Roman Catholic prayers being answered, everyone's great with the literature. When it was other people, no, this literature's invalid. And I don't think we have that problem in the social behavioral epidemiologic part of this field, but maybe. Now this was, I think I included this slide in the handout, because what I said, okay, population level and cross-national effects. This is something, I hope there's time to explain this. This is really interesting. We at Baylor, we have a relationship with the Gallup World Poll. We have access to it. And I was just playing around, and I wish we were just in Washington a couple weeks ago. I was meeting with Jim Clifton and John Clifton. I wish I had thought to bring this up. Let me explain what this is. In the Gallup World Poll, which is a national probability surveys of like 160 some countries. They're doing this every year, and they're going to start doing it quarterly. There were a couple items on religion, not really the greatest, but enough so that the Gallup people scaled them, and a couple small indices of positive and negative well-being. Positive well-being, I mean, the negative well-being kind of looked like sort of a little depressive symptom scale. The positive well-being looked kind of like a positive well-being, maybe life satisfaction kind of thing. I don't recall the exact items, but there in the data there are scales. Anyway, what I did, I looked at the correlation, and then a couple items, 2 or 3 items on health. I looked at the correlation between the religion index and the health index and the positive well-being index and the negative well-being index. This is ecologic data using the 2009 GWP. I haven't published this. And basically, arrayed on I actually had a postdoc do this, arrayed on a list, all 160, one countries, from the highest positive correlation to the greatest negative correlation. So I've left a lot out, but what I've done here, I've just kind of, so for health, I looked at everything that was a positive correlation above 0. And I don't have all the countries here, but like that first group, there were maybe about 14 or 15 that fell into that. But overwhelmingly, the positive correlations were all, not all, but almost all, I'd say the quickly Christianizing parts of Africa. And the strongest negative correlations, again, there were a few others that were amongst them, but I just pulled these out. But overwhelmingly were nations that were part of the former Soviet bloc. And then when you look at positive well-being, negative well-being, basically the same situation. Again, these aren't every country that was in that group, but it's almost every. I mean, now and again, Ireland would pop in somewhere or things like that. But overwhelmingly, there is a salutary salience, I don't know how else to phrase this, of religion according to these couple little measures in relation to health and well-being, positive well-being and then negative well-being, that seems to be strongest amongst nations that if the religious demographers are correct, are quickly becoming Christianized. And religion is being associated in a deleterious fashion, in a depressive-making fashion, in a non-happiness-making fashion, and so on, with these countries that used to be part of the Soviet bloc. There is a whole, what in the world does this mean issue that I have not even begun to engage, and so I haven't even written this. This is not a paper. I don't think it's going to be a paper anytime soon, but given the focus of this meeting, I thought I would throw that out there because I think that's really interesting, and I don't know what it means. And there's 2010 Gallup data. There will be 2011. I can see if this holds, but this is I'm saying we need to do population level cross-national effects. This is one thing to look at. Hopefully, there are databases out there that have better variables than just 2 binary items on religion and 3 or 4 binary items on health that you add together. Just a thought. Okay, and then the last thing, there's some methodological there's some methodological things that we can do that we haven't done. I don't know a lot of time series in this field, mainly because we don't have data sets that collect a huge amount of data every single year. I think potentially the Gallup World Poll, come back in 5 or 10 years, we would do time series. And then the last thing, designs that help us evaluate policy relevant questions. And this is what I kind of want to leave off with, because I think this group here this afternoon, we're going to kind of get into what does this mean, how does this matter, what's the impact on the world in which we live, and so on. And these are just, I throw these out, these are just some, to me, policy relevant questions we might explore. I am not endorsing all these questions. I'm not giving my answer, what I think the answer is on these. I'm not endorsing them. I'm just throwing these out as things we could look at. Does religious participation impact on happiness through decreasing health risks of or mitigating the health consequences of deviant behavior? And when I say deviant behavior, I mean this in the way that sociologists use deviant behavior, just non-normative behavior. I'm not implying, things I can't talk about at Baylor, you know what I mean? But just non-normative, dysfunctional marriages and criminal behavior and so on. And there's been some evidence from sociology that faith, religious participation, mediates the impact of that on poor health. So that's a question. Can religious institutions provide health-impacting resources in times of public resource scarcity? Well, certainly faith-based. There's a whole world of faith-based policy work, not just related to the office, the faith-based office in the last 3 White Houses, but so all kinds of programs all over the world. Think of the PEPFAR program to deal with AIDS in Africa and so on. Faith-based FBOs and FBIs have been focused on picking up the slack, so to speak. But there has not been. If you talk to Byron Johnson, my colleague, we've done a really poor job in evaluating these programs. So there's a whole realm of empirical religion and health research that's not the kind of stuff Lynn and I have talked about, but it's program evaluation, evaluative research, meta-evaluation. So there's a whole other aspect of this. Should belief systems and worldview inform ethical stances and responses regarding healthcare as a common good? There is at least in Judaism, there's a large, growing literature on bioethics. There's a group of Jewish bioethicists. They have an annual meeting. They publish things and so on. But most of the religious bioethical literature has focused on discrete, abortion, euthanasia, test tube babies, xenotransplantation. Much less so on human rights, healthcare, healthcare reform, public health, things like that are global health responsibilities. So I think there's a place for bioethicists in that discourse. Not that we don't need them in the other discourse, but so much of what bioethics is about these discrete medical, clinical interventions. Is religious faith a necessary or sufficient feature of a good life? And there has been within the religion and health field, we're beginning to engage the idea of human flourishing. In fact, there was a conference at Duke a couple years ago on the topic, which is really exciting. And the idea of, eudaimonia, human flourishing. This is really neat. And more please. I think anything that broadens our perspective and makes us think of these things in a wider context is better. We get so focused in on, going to church once a week or less than once a week. Does this affect? That's good. That's been my bread and butter. But there are larger questions about what it means to be a human being, what it means to be in the world, what it means. I mean, I think those of us who do empirical research in sociology and epidemiology would do well to begin kind of deconstructing just well-being, what we mean by well-being. And it typically, as Linda said, is isolated as something discrete within an individual human being's makeup. That's not necessarily the only way to construct this issue. Okay, and then the last thing, can the faith-based sector play a role in efforts to export values that can potentially enhance global security? I think it's a fascinating question, and to quote somebody very famous, this is also above my pay grade, but I just want to put it out here because I think it's fascinating. Is there a meaning for this outside of just the quote health or medical sector? Is there something here that's important? Well, so here's I'll close up with some take-home points. Faith matters, religion matters. I mean, Lynn and I, neither of us presented, data like we would at a science conference or a medical conference, but whatever number, thousands of studies, whatever it is, that shows that religion has something to say about these things for people that value it. And across populations, the effect is on the average, across populations, ceteris paribus, holding everything equal, there seems to be positive association. As far as religious institutions, they can be a force for good or bad when it comes to health or healthcare, health policy. Religion does a tremendous amount of harm. As an epidemiologist, my focus being on the physical and mental health literature, I know that on average it's a salutary effect, but that leaves out, all that means is that on average there's a little more for good or for bad. And in my field, that's what we focus on. We tend to say, okay, these people we won't worry about them. But that's a credible number of people. And the same thing holds there as holds for the effects of religious institutions. So here I'm talking about religious institutions on the prior slide engaging the world through providing services, through providing help. Bioethicists engaging certain conversations. There's no guarantee that the answers that are going to come are going to be good ones. There's no guarantee that people from different traditions will even be saying the same thing. And in some ways, by stating that it'd be great for the religious sector and religious institutions to engage these conversations, as somebody with interest in this topic, I think that would be great, but that could actually serve to foster discord and disharmony more so than we have now, and I think that's inhibited. It's one thing to do these little papers and publish them in epidemiology journals. Hopefully it does some good, but it's not going to, the world's not going to spin off its axis as a result. This, I don't know. This, what we're saying we want to do at this meeting is engage a topic that a lot of people won't be happy about, and we may not, like some of the answers we see. So it's just something to keep in mind. And so, but the thing that I would say is we aren't served by superficial research. We need to focus better conceptually, theoretically, and methodologically. And this is, I review tons of papers for lots of people. I'm always reviewing papers. And I think one of my colleagues said they can always tell when I reviewed it because I always focus on, okay, conceptually, theoretically, methodologically. These are like buzzwords to me. We need to excel at each one of those areas. And when I critique a paper, I like to step through each one of those things. So these are almost as buzzwords for me. But inadequate research doesn't help anybody. And here we've talked about thousands of studies. Believe me, they aren't all good. In fact, most of them are what on a stick, if I can say that. But fortunately, I think the good ones outweigh that. Also, the sorts of questions that have been answered to now don't necessarily give us the information we need to address these policy questions. There's kind of a disconnect. So we have all this empirical data on religion and health within human bodies and populations, and yet that this larger discussion needs to be engaged. I don't know that the empirical research gives us a whole lot to hang a hat on to go into this other discussion. We didn't talk about that. I think it gives us very little. It gives us a hint that this is a force that can be positive in people's lives in certain discrete ways. But beyond that, I don't know. And then it's my last slide. I'll just read the quote. I certainly don't have all or even many of the answers about how we might usefully go about identifying worldviews and their consequences, but I believe the efforts to do so would make a vital contribution to our understanding of links between religion and health at a level of reality that does full justice to the power and ultimate grace of the human spirit. This came from Linda's book. Amen. I think that's very good. I agree with that.
When was the last time you attended a conference where everything ended exactly?
Did I?
The miracle continues.
Well, I have my lucky Hebrew watch that my grandfather gave me from Tel Aviv. It actually doesn't have numbers, so I knew I would end when both dials were on the bait and the yud or whatever. So I'm all.
Thank you. Brandon.
Sure.
Bravo. Please join me in applauding Linda and Jack.